In today's economy, many of the most important financial decisions we make happen well before we realize the consequences. How much we save, how we manage debt, whether we invest and which route to take. And yet, around the world, financial literacy remains surprisingly low. Studies consistently find that only 1/3 of adults can explain basic concepts like interest rates, inflation, and diversification.
When you look at the data, you see that people are very similar, for example, in terms of characteristics of economic circumstances, but yet they would get at retirement with vastly different amount of wealth. And I always thought there is something more, or there is something that is missing in this model we are considering. How can somebody have the same income, the same education level, but then be so different throughout life?
I'm Neale Mahoney, economist and director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And on this episode of Econ To Go, I sit down with Stanford professor Annamaria Lusardi here on campus. She spent decades studying financial literacy, how people learn it, why it matters, and how better financial education can help people navigate everything from student loans to retirement planning. Because in a world of increasingly complex financial products, understanding money isn't just useful, it's essential. A lot of people, I think, still view financial literacy as a nice to have, not a must have, like some of the other core topics in economics and in the social sciences. I assume you disagree. Why?
I strongly disagree, first of all, because I think the world has changed so much that everybody needs this skill. And this has exactly to do with what we've seen in other cases in the education itself, right? As the world became more and more complex, right, we require more and more education, right? At the beginning, the required education was only elementary education, and now we made it compulsory to have at least a high school education. I think it's the same for this topic. If you are not financially literate, if you don't understand the basics of finance, you are basically excluded from the world. You are not able to, first of all, understand the world around you, but in particular, taking advantage of what the financial world around you can offer.
And so you can, get training, residency, fellowship, become an incredible surgeon, but if you don't know how to keep your financial house in order, that human capital won't have the same payoff as it would if you knew how to invest your money, how to plan for retirement, how to insure yourself against risks. And so it's an important complement to all of the other skills you're making.
Absolutely. And I love the framing as a human capital development, right? It's basically something that, you acquire and can really give an important payoff over time. And I'm not the only one to say that. In particular, the OECD, for example, started this important project, PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, measuring the skills that young people need to have today in order to participate to society. And already in 2012, so many years ago, they added financial literacy to that set of skills because it's essential for a young person to have this knowledge. And it's particularly important today, given the changes we observe in the economy, we observe in our world. So, the 2012 report they wrote was Financial Literacy, an Essential Skill for the 21st Century. And I think, if there is a title or a report I would like everybody to read, is exactly that one.
When a new financial product enters the market, buy now, pay later, crypto, stablecoin, what are the roles of financial education versus regulation in terms of providing the information, the protection that consumers need?
A lot of people always ask me whether, financial education is more important than regulation or what is the role. And I think we should never say this or that. I think they are both important, right? It's not that we can put so much responsibility into the shoulder of individual and having them make financial decisions, it can be very complex, in particular with respect to a new product. So when a new product comes in, I think it's very important for the regulator to understand whether it hurts or helps consumers And so education is, I think, a very important complement to regulation. They should work together. It's not only education on only regulation. And if you have regulation only without education, I actually think you probably, are going to see a lot more problems, because at the end, people have to understand what they engage into or what they buy or what they use.
Is there an example where the regulation and financial education work in concert, work well together, something that can guide us?
I remember, for example, when we look at the credit cards and when, previous regulation thought, why don't credit card, for example, report the minimum payment you have to make, right, in order to pay off your credit card in a certain amount of time, on how to simplify that information so that consumer, when they get the credit card, can actually get a good prospect for them to make decisions. I think that's a good example of a good regulation, right? Provide good information and make also that information available. And education, I think, can complement that, because people have to understand how credit cards work. Right? And they have to still make good decisions.
With financial education, you can then do disclosure regulation and give people the information that then they can process within, the frameworks that they've learned from financial
Absolutely.
education.
Otherwise, you have to go much simpler. And sometimes, right, it's also very difficult to do that. So I think, regulation and education, I think, overall, if they can work together, I think they are going to be much more powerful.
And what's the role of the workplace in providing financial education to employees?
I think it's an essential role. When you look at the adult population, right, where are they? They are at work. And so that's an important place where to provide education. Also, I think it's in the interest of the employer to provide that education. One of the statistics we find in our work with the TIA Institute and the Personal Finance Index, we found that people spend an average of 4 to 5 hours per week at work dealing with their financial problems and decisions, and those with low financial literacy even more. So again, if you multiply this by the wage, I think we can think of many programs which are more cost effective than having, your employee worried about their finances. And so there is also an incentive from the employer to actually have, their employee be financially secure, be more financially resilient, and be also better prepared, both for shock and also for retirement.
There's been a movement for workplace wellness programs trying to improve the physical health of employees so that they're less likely to be sick and have disabilities and healthcare costs. And this is very similar in that, trying to improve their financial health. So
it is financial health. I have to say, we have done many of these studies ourselves, and also we have done some program ourselves at the workplace education, interestingly, in our own institution. So we did actually program at Dartmouth College and at GW as well. And in our evaluation, these programs are cost effective, not just effective per se, not just they improve some of the financial decisions, but they are also cost effective. And so I actually think these are important initiatives to pursue.
Financial topics can often seem intimidating or technical, but you've said they're actually deeply personal. How do you get people to see that personal connection?
So first of all, I always say personal finance is personal. And I use that in my class a lot, and I try to make concepts simpler and more engaging via storytelling. So now I always start my course by telling several stories, including my own story. And why, by the way, I am statistically the least likely person to be an expert in personal finance.
Why are you statistically the least likely person to be an expert in personal finance?
Because I have 3 characteristics that prevent me from being, in a sense, financially literate. First of all, I am a woman, and there is a gender difference in financial literacy, interestingly, in every country around the world. I am Italian. And so Italian are one of the countries with the lowest level of financial literacy. And I am an older woman. I am older than 60, even though probably, I hope it doesn't show. But so all of these characteristics make me the least likely. to be a financially literate person, but I always say statistics is not our destiny.
Yeah.
And, we can change it with education.
Annamaria argues that financial literacy isn't just an economic skill. It's something that often starts with personal experience. Over coffee, she tells me how conversations around her family's dinner table shape the way she thinks about money today.
So my parents talk to us a lot about money. My parents are both entrepreneurs. They have 3 daughters. And they found, at the dinner table, they found it very natural to talk about money. And we talked a lot, often about some of the decisions they made when they bought, for example, their house. They discussed this briefly with us. And I thought that had an incredibly important part in my life, because I always thought that money was interesting, was something to consider, was something useful to be knowledgeable about.
Was there a moment where you realized that not everybody grew up with that sort of financial education around the kitchen table?
The moment I realized that is when I actually did a study looking at the young people, which were 23 to 28 years old. First of all, I was very surprised to see how little this generation knows. Everybody thinks that, young people, which are young professionals, in particular with high level of education, would be financially literate. And according to our statistics, they are not. But we also had a panel data set, and we could link their financial literacy to their own knowledge and the knowledge of their parents when they were teenagers and growing up. And we saw that people who are financially literate 10 years later are those who were discussing this topic at the dinner table when they were teenagers. So it seems that some of my experience as well was reflected in the data and the experience of other young people.
You've compared financial literacy to health in that it's something that you should check in on periodically. What does a financial health checkup look like?
We design a very simple checkup, only kind of 7 concepts. It's like 7 steps to financial success, something like that. It's always 7, right? So the first one is, do you know the basics? Do you have the knowledge of this fundamental concept in personal finance? Do you know the power of interest compounding? Do you know inflation? Do you know about risk and risk diversification? If people know that, I think, they are already on a good path to make good financial decisions.
Step 1 is these 3 basic principles of financial decision making. Step 2.
Step 2 is, do you have a budget? Right? The budget is important because we have so many incentives to spend, right? I tell my student, by the time you go back to your room, you'll have 5 opportunities to spend today, but not many opportunities to save, right? So we need to keep control of our spending, and we need to have a plan for how we allocate our income, and also a plan to grow our wealth.
Number 2 is a budget. What's number 3?
Number 3, do you have control of your debt? Right? That is very important. And if you carry credit card debt, right, then you are normally charged relatively high interest rate. And so this debt can quickly escalate into high amount. And we know, for example, young people, but everybody, now today, have a lot of debt, from student loan to mortgages to auto loans and so on. Is your debt under control? That's an important piece in our checkup. Continuing on that, are you maximizing your credit score? Right? This is very important because, the interest rate you are going to be charged
so it
depends
feeds
on the
through
credit
into your interest
score.
rates, into your credit limits, into access to credit.
Yeah. I tell my student, is your financial GPA. Try to get as high a financial GPA as possible.
Except one without as much grade inflation. So
Right, exactly. It tells us a lot about how you are managing your debt. And are you paying on time? Are you paying in full? Are you keeping your credit utilization under a certain limit? The credit score is critically important for the interest rate you are going to be charged. So that's a good way also to pay, in a sense, the lowest in debt and in debt management.
Monitor and to optimize your credit score.
Yeah. The next one, are you investing to maximize your wealth? I always tell everybody you have got to learn how to invest. Now, the entering amount for investing in the market is very low. With fractional shares and also with this low, with $50, you can invest for the long term. And, this is something important to do if you want to grow your wealth.
And what's the next one?
So the next one is, are you taking advantage of tax favor asset and employer matches? In addition to financial markets, both the government and the employer are having incentives for you to save, in particular for the long term. Are you taking advantage of that? You can save a lot of taxes if you, for example, invest in an IRA, in a Roth IRA, in a 401k. These are substantial benefits that the government offer you to save for the future or to save for your child education with a 529 and other similar asset. The employer often offer a match. If you don't take advantage of
and like a
this
one-for-one match.
It's a one-to-one.
Doubling the money.
No financial, instrument is able to offer this very high return. You are leaving money on the table if you don't take advantage of that. And by the way, look for employers that have these good benefits in order to grow your wealth. So very important to do that. And then 7 is, are you planning for the future? And the future being potentially even the short term. For example, are you setting aside a stock of precautionary savings so that, you are able to face shocks, but also are you preparing for planned event? For example, if you want to buy a house, a car in the future, if you want to take time off or for your retirement. We see that people who plan end up at retirement with vastly different amount of wealth than those who do not plan. So this act of planning really changes what you do. You probably are spending less on certain things. You are probably more aware of what it takes, to reach certain objective and taking more steps for that. So I think it's, again, if you want to do well, like some planning can really do a lot.
Because if you plan for a rainy day rather than borrow on a credit card, right, it's going to be much cheaper. If you save for down payment rather than take out a larger mortgage, your interest rate is going to be much lower. And so that planning is, I guess you said, the last but not least sort of step in this financial checkup.
Yeah, this planning gives rise to all of this other good behavior that you have mentioned, and probably also you're probably starting to save earlier, right? And so the earlier you save, the more you can take advantage of interest compounding. And it's also easier to save, smaller amount than bigger amount when you are, let's say, 10 to 15 years away for retirement. So these are simple steps, by the way, that everybody can take. And if we do that, I think we can all do better. We can all, I think, be healthier, financially speaking, and we can, in a sense, achieve, financial resilience and financial security. So a good financial health.
The point that you made is sort of a little bit of knowledge can go a long way, right? We all know people who get into the weeds of optimizing credit card points and retirement savings. You don't have to go that far to do a lot of good for yourself, right?
Absolutely.
You can just take some simple steps and get 90% of the way there, not leave money on the table, hold a diversified portfolio, save for the future, manage your debt. And I think that's a really key takeaway.
Absolutely.
Like, you don't have to be a financial whiz.
Absolutely. You don't have to be a financial expert.
Like literacy, it's important and it's also achievable. 7 steps that, may not turn you into Warren Buffett, but can put your financial house in order.
Exactly. And that's what we want to do. We don't go to the doctor, because we want to run a marathon or because we want to be an athlete, but because we want to lead a good life. And it's the same for financial health. We want to be financially resilient and financially secure so we can do what we would like to do with our financial resources.
Research shows that small financial decisions can have big long-term consequences. But those decisions are shaped by a misunderstanding about how money and investing actually work. So at the cafe, I ask Annamaria about the most common misconceptions she sees.
I think there are so many misconceptions about money. For example, a lot of people think that, managing money is just for the rich, right? And that others shouldn't, pay attention to money because, they don't have money to manage with to start with. So, that's, I think, a first misconception. Everybody should take care of their financial health. The second thing is that investing is like gambling, right? It's a game. And also that people should pick individual stocks. That's how people invest and should, that's the way to get rich. While the academic research says just invest in stock index fund, invest in the market with very low cost. But most importantly, I think, probably not taking care of your financing, also thinking that something very complex, first of all, and that you are not able to do, and that is something that only the rich do, I think is probably the most important misconception we need to fight.
Are there particular areas of the financial marketplace where you think consumers are especially at risk today?
We see that people are particularly at risk, actually this is almost plain in words, with investing and risk management. These are the topics that people know the least. And I see this continuously, I think, in the interaction with my student or even in the interaction with friends. If you ask people what they know the least is investing. And today, with so many new financial instruments at your disposal, you could indeed be at risk of making poor financial decisions. One of the, of course, topic that we can think about is crypto. Right? So, for example, our undergraduate students are very interested in that. But, when you try to understand how much they know about them, they know very little. Yet they are very eager to invest in something they do not know. Right? Buy now, pay later. It's so easy now to buy and just pay later. Right? Buy now, pay now might be, a good rule to follow. And now we have access, for example, now, even in your retirement, you might have an opportunity to invest, let's say, in private equity, right? Do you know that? Do you know the risk involved with that? There are indeed, several areas in which, or any time we have some, new option, a new financial instrument, we need to think a little bit more about, do people understand the opportunities that this instrument bring, including the risk that this instrument, might bring.
The literature has, always pointed to sort of holding a well-diversified index fund and minimizing fees. Is that your reading of the literature still today?
Yes. So first of all, I really wish, one of the things I always characterize a lot and emphasize a lot in my course is that people don't have to pick individual stocks, even though I think a lot of people think that investing is that, right? And also people, I think, are really enamored with their own company on top of this, right? So, risk diversification, I think, is something that people do not either, appreciate as much or perhaps do not grasp so well. And that I think the academic literature is very clear, right? That the best way to invest is to be well diversified, so buy mutual funds or ETF, and to try to keep the cost as low as possible, the fees as low as possible.
Do you think regulators have underestimated how quickly the exploding complexity can outpace consumers' understanding?
It's hard to say. I mean, clearly, it's a world that's changing very quickly. We see a lot of financial innovation. And I think not just in the asset side, but also on the debt side. And so, it's hard to keep track, and it's hard to keep attention to this. But I think regulators have an important job to do in making sure that the financial system works for everyone, and also that the instruments that are offered are really providing good opportunity for consumers, and not only for the financial industry.
So if you're writing a syllabus for your financial literacy course today, what's one thing that you would include on the syllabus now that you might not have included a decade ago?
I know that now with the higher cost of education and also with the prospect, the job market being more difficult and so on, I think I don't want young people to be discouraged by thinking of this very important investment, which is investment in education. People always say many of the jobs in the future have not been invented yet, right? But in this very complex world, I am actually convinced that you need skills and knowledge. You need, maybe different skills and also skills that makes you able to be adaptable, makes you able to reason, it makes you able to really capture, in a sense, these new skills that are offered. But I am convinced that education can offer a very important rate of return. I would say sometime a lot higher than the financial market.
Yeah, I once went to a lecture by Gary Becker who argued in an uncertain world, sort of a liberal arts education, which provides you with the flexibility, the agility for like a job that doesn't exist yet, is the best investment you can make.
Absolutely. And I think a liberal art education at the undergraduate level can be a very important investment that you can do to better understand the world around you. You don't need to specialize early on. That's maybe the time to really be able to have a critical mind and to acquire this capacity, right? To be flexible, to be resilient.
Anna, it was amazing to have you on Econ To Go. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Financial decisions shape everything from how we manage debt to how we prepare for retirement. But making those decisions well requires knowledge that many people simply haven't been taught. And yet, as Annamaria makes clear, education alone isn't enough. Regulation needs to move with it, especially as new and more complex products enter the market. I want to thank Annamaria Lusardi for joining me in this conversation and you for listening. I'm Neale Mahoney, and Econ To Go is where we bring Stanford economics into your everyday life. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts. We've got more smart, curious conversations coming your way from the Stanford University campus.